Good morning, good morning, good morning. It is September 26th, and we're kicking off our fall lecture series with our perennial favorite, Matt Gibson. So first, a couple of warnings, same warnings as always. Those of you who are part of the channel know what I'm about to say, but let me say it because I do enjoy the melodious sound of my own voice. First, anything we say is on this forum is private, but these videos are public. And these videos will be placed in a whole bunch of public fora. So be aware that anything you say is being recorded and can be used and will be displayed publicly. Secondly, let's get a membership drive push going. We're at about 20,000 members across our various fora. But I think the Ontario Real Estate Forum, the main one, is at about 14. Let's see if we can get 15 before, I don't know, let's say December. Let's go. Because come December, we, of course, have our charity events. And the more people we have, the more we were able to raise last year. To remind everyone, we raised, I think, $25,000 for breast cancer. This year, we're looking at another worthy charity. Looking forward to getting that done. And of course, the more people we have, the better off we are. Not setting aside the fact that we're all more powerful, the more that join and are able to contribute to the forum on a daily basis. Today, I have the privilege of reintroducing Matt Gibson to the forum. I say reintroducing because Matt has been here and has talked to us about power of sales before. But the reason that there is heightened interest in this is because, as you guys are aware, participants in the market, either lawyers or realtors or mortgage brokers or whatever, power of sales is becoming a real factor in the market. We are at a breaking point with the Canadian consumer. The bubble territory that broke in the fever of 2022 left people with property prices that were far divorced from Canadian income, meaning that upon holding their breath for a period of time, many people are now finding that they simply cannot hold on and are being forced to sell by various lenders. That is where, of course, Matt Gibson comes in. There's a significant difference between lawyers who litigate and specialize in given areas and those who do not. We say this all the time on the forum. And it always pays to listen to the experts in the fields. Matt's particular expertise is in power of sale work and assisting realtors and other lawyers, by the way, very generously. I can't tell you how many times I ask Matt questions and others ask Matt questions pertaining to the power of sale process and how it actually works. Realtors who are now functioning in the space, even those who are seasoned, have not seen power of sales in significant volume for a long time, but that is now coming back to the fore. So we all kind of need to sharpen our pencils and learn how to do it. I can think of no better person to teach us than Matt. Matt is a recognized expert in the area. We're incredibly grateful for his time and his attention today. So you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear Matt. I'm turning it over to him. Matt, everyone is on mute. I will help you through the questions once you're done. I'll read some of them, and to the extent that I can answer just to take the questions off, I will as you're kind of going forward. Everyone who has a question, just please wait till the end, or alternatively raise your hand using Zoom, and we will turn our attention to as many questions as we can at the end of the session. So Matt, over to you. Let's move on.
Wonderful. Well, that's quite the introduction, but I appreciate it. I would not consider myself, I would never call myself an expert, but I do this every day. Seems like all day these days. So I'm happy to share my experience and what we're seeing and what that means for clients on both sides of the situation. Invariably, some of you will have questions I've never even thought of, and so I always look forward to getting those. And if I can't give you an answer today, I will endeavor to get you an answer after this presentation. Someone always comes up with something, and that's a great. I've never encountered that. I've never even thought of that. Yeah, so I'm going to be sort of walking us through today what the new sort of landscape of power of sale looks like. So I've been in this space for I've been a lawyer since 2012, but I've been focused in the mortgage enforcement space for the last 5 years, and came into it through by way of a former mentor. And yeah, it is exploded, and definitely didn't anticipate it necessarily getting this big. But it's just a sort of a commentary on the financial situation of in our province right now, especially in the real estate market where we're at. So we're going to be talking about a couple major topics here today. Number one, what's happening in mortgage defaults recently and what's happening in the mortgage space currently. What are the causes? Some of them you'll be aware of and are pretty obvious, but there's some others that I would like to talk about. And then what does this mean for stakeholders? And by that, I mean real estate agents, lawyers, mortgage brokers, mortgage investors, and mortgagors, mortgage holders, because some of you are going to have clients that are on the bad side of the situation, the wrong side of this equation, and need help to understand what's going on. And the more you understand this process and what's going on in the larger picture, the better you're going to be equipped to advise them. So, of course, just the quick overview, and again, as Mark mentioned, I've done presentations on this before, so there are more detailed presentations available on what the power of sale process looks like on a step-by-step basis. But the sort of overarching understanding of the process is the owner, which is known as the mortgagor, the person who has borrowed the money, has defaulted on their mortgage, generally through non-payment, but it could also be through letting their insurance lapse, letting a tax certificate for property tax arrears get registered on their property. There are other types of defaults, but in this scenario, most common is I missed a mortgage payment or I've missed 6 mortgage payments. And so the bank or the mortgagee, private lender, mortgage investment corporation, what have you, has taken possession of the property or started the process of getting legal possession of the property in order to sell it to recover the amounts owing under the mortgage. The mortgagee in possession, it's very important to define this. A lot of people assume that the lender, be it the bank or a private lender, takes ownership of the property. That's not, in fact, the case. They take legal possession. Ownership transfers to the new purchaser under the sale under power of sale. But ownership never transfers to the bank or the mortgagee. That only occurs in a foreclosure action. Foreclosures are happening a lot. They happen a lot less often than power sale because they are a more onerous and generally a costly process. But actually, as I'll talk about in a little bit, we are seeing that rise as well due to mortgages that are essentially underwater and are more than the equity in the property. And then one other thing to mention is under the power sale process, the mortgagee does have an obligation to sell for fair market value or at least make best efforts to do so. And that's also becoming a challenge in today's market as values are dropping. There's less buying power. We're seeing more where, maybe I had an appraisal from a year ago that said it was worth 7, and now an appraisal is coming back saying it's 550. Well, my mortgage was 80% of 700, not 80% of 550. That's creating issues. That's creating challenges. Properties are sitting on the market longer, which means more arrears. So it's just becoming a more challenging and onerous process there. So I was doing some, obviously I see it from an anecdotal perspective in my daily practice as we're just busier and busier every day. But I wanted to get some sort of hard numbers for everyone. And so it's interesting looking at the hard numbers because, we live in a clickbait world. Sometimes you see an article and it says, mortgage defaults skyrocket this year and delinquency rates doubled and these things and the other things. And then when you actually drill down on the numbers, the overall volumes are still not massive. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. This is not, every third person on the block is losing their house. So in Q1 of 2024, there were over $1 billion worth of mortgages that were over 90 days in arrears. So that's what we call a delinquent mortgage, is 90 plus days in arrears. So they've missed 3 mortgage payments. That's the first time that's ever happened. As well, in 2024 to date, in Q1 of 2024, 34,000 households are delinquent on their mortgage of at least one payment. And that's a 23% increase from the same quarter in 2023. So that is a significant jump. 23% over last year is a significant jump for sure. It's the highest in Ontario compared to the rest of Canada. Ontario just has the biggest issues. We also seem to have the most runaway real estate values. So I'm sure that's a part of the reason. And just to sort of show what the big banks are doing, the 6 major banks in Canada set aside an additional $1.6 billion in provisions for credit losses. So basically, last year they put about $3 billion aside. This year they put about $4.6 billion aside to just say, okay, we're going to start losing money on some mortgages. We need to be able to cover those losses. We need some extra money in the kitty. So we're putting some extra money aside. And part of that as well is preparing for that wave of renewals that we're all expecting in 2025 and 2026, when people that locked in at a 2.5% rate when they bought their house 3 years ago, 4 years ago, are suddenly facing a 5% rate on a mortgage they can no longer afford. So when you look at the numbers like that, it seems kind of crazy and it seems a little intense. And you're like, no wonder people are losing their houses left, right, and center. However, when you look at the overall percentage, so CMHC reported a delinquency rate of 0.15% in Q1 of 2023 and a 0.19% delinquency rate in Q1 of 2024. So like 0.2%, 1/5 of 1% in Q1. So again, on an overall numerical basis, not a huge amount. And when you compare that to the 2010s, where it was around 0.35, 0.38, we're still in a much better position than we were, 10, 15 years ago in terms of delinquency rates. So that's important context to keep in mind. And something that I was sort of surprised to see those numbers, that they were, as relatively low as they actually are. That being said, for lack of subtlety, privates are worse. So those figures, those CMHC figures that I just went through, those are just for the institutional mortgages. So the big banks, the FCT, et cetera. It does not include private lenders. So private lenders being private individuals, mortgage investment corporations, people that invest in mortgages through their RSPs, such as with Olympia Trust. So the CMHC data on those show that nearly 1% of private mortgages were delinquent in 2023, which is about 6 times the institutional rate. As well, we've seen that private lender market share grew up to 8% of the total mortgage market share in 2023, and I believe it's even higher in 2024. I don't have the numbers for that, but it is continuing to grow. People are relying more on private mortgages, and we know why that is. They are not qualifying for bank mortgages because of increasing interest rates, higher stress tests, higher property values, meaning you need a much higher, loan to value amount, meaning that, it's harder to qualify. So people are looking to private lenders who have, generally lower thresholds, are looking more at equity value than they are at ability to pay. And so we're seeing more and more people relying on those. And the risk with private lenders, and the reason we're seeing an increase in the mortgage enforcement side of that, is privates are faster to act on defaults. They don't have $4.6 billion set aside to cover their losses. They have less liquidity. They often are accountable to their investors. So a mortgage investment corporation, for example, I as an individual can lend, $100,000 or invest $100,000 through a mortgage investment corporation. They'll take my 100, they'll take someone else's 100, and they'll lend $300,000 to someone. Well, I'm expecting a guaranteed return of 7, 8, 9% on a monthly basis. So if they need to make those payments to me, whether or not they're collecting the payments, that's obviously a problem for them. So they need to be faster to act when those mortgagors go into default. And then the other, issue there, or the other reason they're faster to act, is that they generally are lending out at higher rates. Banks right now we're seeing 4 to 6% generally. Private lenders, you're looking at 8 to 12, sometimes 15, 18 if they're second and third mortgages on a risky property. So as soon as those mortgages go into arrears, those arrears start adding up really quickly. And so those lenders are just less patient when it comes to delinquencies. I did find a stat that said, which was a study by Land Bank. They looked at about 1,000 sales last year and found that 90% of the forced sales in the GTA, so sales where they were either being sold by the mortgagee in possession or being sold by the owner under distress, were properties that had, as you can see, it's a pretty significant amount. The pressure that private lenders put mortgagors is much higher than the banks are putting on mortgagors. As Mark mentioned, and as I sort of mentioned earlier, anecdotally, my caseload has continued to grow. I'm actually looking to hire a young associate. Well, they don't have to be young, a junior associate. Where we're seeing it is we're just too busy. So then, of course, the question is, we understand that's the situation situation, but why? What's causing this? And the obvious answer that everyone knows is higher interest rates, inflation, cost of living, higher property values. It's just, or property costs, I should say. We're just seeing life is more expensive. Canadians are struggling with debt. Coming out of the pandemic, the consumer debt levels are at a record high, and people are just really hitting that wall of, I can't make my payments anymore. I got myself into a situation, often by no fault of their own, and we'll talk about some of those situations. And now I can't get out, and now I'm in arrears, and I can't, afford my mortgage. As I mentioned, the upcoming renewals on those sort of fixed rate or fixed payment mortgages that were locked in at 2 and are now going to be renewed at 5. Buyers that bought based not on the value of the property, but on how much their payments would be. That was, a very common theme among clients in, 4 or 5 years ago. Well, yeah, I know it's I know it's $1 million house, but my payments will only be $2,500, so I can afford that. Well, yeah, they were $2,500. Now they're going to be $4,000. That's a big difference. We've also, or at least in my office, and I'm sure many of the other lawyers and mortgage brokers are seeing, huge amounts of refinances these days to consolidate existing consumer debt. So credit cards, lines of credit, short-term loans. And many of those people have or will be turning to private lenders to cover that gap, saying, okay, my credit card's 25%. I'm going to step down to 9, 10, 11% with a private lender, pay those debts off. And then a year from now, when my credit is improved further, I'm going to go to an A lender or a B lender and just sort of work down that ladder of debt, which is a great approach when it works. Unfortunately, as we see, property values drop, it's harder to refi out of that private mortgage into that A or B mortgage, and now you're stuck paying 9, 10%, and that again is creating that pressure. The other thing I see, and this drives me personally nuts, just because I see it on my Instagram every day, and then I see those same people's names on the statements of claim I'm sending out. But it's these BRR, I can't remember how many R's there are, influencers. So the buy, rehabilitate, renovate, rent, refinance, buy, right? That idea of buy a property, fix it up, rent it out, refinance that, take that equity out, buy the next property. Next thing you know, you got 10 properties. Now you're passive income cash flow bullshit. Unfortunately, that only works when property values keep going up, or you're increasing the value of the property through renovations, through rentals, etc. As we know, when values drop, interest rates go up, your cash flow becomes negative, and suddenly the equity is not sufficient to cover the debt. Now what do you do? Now you've got an anchor around your neck that you can't deal with. And we've seen a ton of that with people that, got involved in this idea of passive income, best investment. It's kind of the same as, and I'm not an expert in the market, but it's kind of the same as, crypto bros, like, oh, you can't lose if you buy this random Dogecoin, and then it, tanks, and everyone, people are posting that they lost $100,000 on a meme stock. So, obviously the property flipping world can work, and a lot of people do make good money off of it. But what I've seen personally is people that, take one online course, buy 3 properties, finance themselves to the hilt, and then suddenly are confused when the values drop, or they're not collecting rent anymore, and suddenly they can't pay and they don't know what to do. So I think we're going to see a lot of those started to coming to the market as well. And I'm going to talk in a second about arguably the largest version of that scam, or that sort of hustle, in a second. The third big thing that we're seeing is bad tenants, and unfortunately a worse tribunal, which is the landlord-tenant board. As many of you or all of you probably know, the landlord-tenant board is a joke right now. It is backed up 8 to 12 months. Tenants are able to, just basically stop paying and live rent-free for almost a year. And there are very few things that the landlords are able to do. There was a whole article this morning about that. I get the Hamilton Spectator on the weekends and Thursdays, and there was a big long article in the Spectator about all of the challenges that the real estate industry is facing because of the lack of enforceability of leases on residential properties. So we're seeing people that, with best intentions, bought an investment property, rented it out, had good tenants, those tenants, for whatever reason, stop making payments. Maybe they lose their job, they fall in hard times, whatever, and they learn through through the news that, well, I'm not going to get kicked out for 8 or 10 months, 12 months. Why would I leave now? I'll just stay here. Maybe my landlord will offer me 20 grand to leave. But in the meantime, that landlord who has a mortgage on that property that was counting on that income and that rental income to pay the mortgage is now left holding the bag and can't make the mortgage payments and can't sell the property because they can't get the tenants in. So that is a huge problem right now, is investors getting screwed by tenants. And again, I'm not throwing blame on anybody. There's obviously reasons why a lot of tenants are unable to make payments, but because there is no enforcement mechanism, or at least no effective enforcement mechanism right now, it's very difficult to resolve those issues and get a new tenant in or sell the property off and pay the mortgage off. And so again, we're now seeing the bank stepping in or the lender stepping in, seizing the property, either attorning the rents from the tenants and taking them to the landlord tenant board, or paying them out. I've had clients that are paying anywhere from 8 to 10 to, in one case, 20 grand to get rid of problem tenants, because it was going to be way faster and arguably cheaper than waiting to get an eviction order from the board. So that's becoming a massive issue. And then the last thing is what I call full-on fraud, and this is where you've probably seen this in the news, but this is we'll call it the I call it the Happy Gilmore case, because that's one of the numbered companies, or one of the holding companies. But you've also may have heard of Lion Share Group, Windrose Group, Sid Developments, Dylan Suter, Robbie, I think his name's Robbie Walker. Robbie Clark, Ryan Maloney. Basically what this was, or what this is, because it's still ongoing. I have clients that are involved in this, not with mortgages I set up, thank God, or put together, but clients that have since come to me because of this issue. So essentially, there were a number of companies owned primarily by these four investors. It was Sid Developments was the big one, and there were 11 other companies. Like I said, Happy Gilmore Inc. or Limited or something was one of them. I've had to write that on a statement of claim, which as a kid growing up watching Adam Sandler movies, I never thought I'd do. But and essentially what they did is they borrowed money from private investors to purchase hundreds of residential properties that were generally in very rough shape, and generally in smaller markets like Sault Ste. Marie, Timmins, and Windsor. And the idea was, like I said, the BRRR method. You buy these distressed properties, you fix them up, you increase the rents, you make them cash flow positive, you buy the next thing, and you build this massive, their goal was build this massive real estate empire across Ontario. The problem was these guys don't know what they're doing. They didn't fix up the properties. They became basically slumlords for most of these properties, and they misappropriated a lot of the funds, which we're now discovering. Most of these mortgages, the vast majority of these mortgages, were arranged by one mortgage broker and brokerage in Oakville. Her name's Claire Drage. This is all public information, so none of this is, privileged information. And her brokerage, Windrose, the Lion Share Group, which basically took in private investors' money and then lent it to these various corporations to invest in these properties. Now, a lot of these were secured by mortgages, but a lot of them were not. And this is the most shocking thing, is a lot of these were secured, quote unquote, by promissory notes that were backed up by Claire Drage's promise, her personal guarantee, basically. Well, the problem is when you borrow 15, 20, $25 million in promissory notes, it doesn't matter how hard you promise, you don't have that $25 million to back it up. And there's no actual asset secured against that promissory note secured against. When these guys go bankrupt, as they've done, if you're a promissory note holder, you're basically, your note is worth the paper it's printed on. So that's been a huge scandal and an ongoing disaster. As the bankruptcy proceeding has gone forward, so they applied and were granted what's called CCAA protection, which basically says, okay, there's so many lawsuits and there's so many creditors here. We're going to appointed administrator. We're going to stop people from being able to individually sue these guys, and everything's kind of going to get funneled through one process. The benefit of that is you don't have 100 individuals bringing 100 individual lawsuits and having to deal with all that. The downside is you have 100 people or 200 people that are dealing with one administrator, and that administrator is obviously charging their fees, and a lot of these people are sort of upset at how the process has gone and don't feel that they've been properly represented. What has been most interesting through the whole process is the discovery of what a lot of this money was actually spent on. And this is just a sort of rule of thumb. If you're investing in someone who's posting content about hanging out on yachts and flying on private jets when they're supposed to be buying, slummy real estate in Sault Ste. Marie, you're probably investing with the wrong person. And this whole process has been quite enlightening on what was actually going on with a lot of this money. So I have a number of clients, as I said, who are going through this process, who are potentially doing, either credit bids or hoping to recover money through the bankruptcy process. But it's going to be long and it's going to be messy, and there's going to be a lot of people that lose out. And one of the big issues is these guys bought so much property in these smaller towns and smaller cities that now that they're all coming back onto the market to be sold off by this, bankruptcy trustee administrator, the market's just going to be flooded. And there's not a huge appetite in some of these markets for residential rental properties. And then again, we go back to the issue of, do they have tenants and how we're dealing with all that. So I have at least one client who's now going to become a sort of reluctant landlord of two properties in Sault Ste. Marie, because it's the only way he can recover his money is to do a credit bid, which is essentially a form of foreclosure. And now he owns this property that, mortgage income on it. So until my internet was a little unstable there, but anyway, so that's kind of the, what's going on and why. And then just to sort of mention another case that you may have seen in the news that I've been personally involved in is a large group of commercial real estate investors in Hamilton known as Forge and Foster. Again, it's been published in the newspaper, so none of this is privileged information. Similar issue. They bought a number of commercial properties, mostly around the Hamilton and Niagara area. But it's now since come to light that basic mismanagement and alleged misuse of the funds that were lent to them has led to dozens of commercial properties that are underwater from a cash flow perspective. The rents just weren't properly collected or weren't properly recorded. And so then the lenders are now having to take them back and rehabilitate the rents, get new tenants in, et cetera, and sell them off. And I'm involved in a number of those, and it's quite messy. The most interesting one was the Ancaster Springs camping park, where they installed a number of tiny homes that they had sold off to buyers for a couple $100,000, basically as this is a solution to the housing crisis. You can now buy essentially a glorified RV or a glorified trailer and live at this park for 11 and a half months, because it was seasonal use. So they had to leave for 2 weeks of the year. That was their sort of workaround. Well, unfortunately, the city of Hamilton said, no, those are not trailers. Those are permanent structures. They have septic tanks. They are hooked up to water. These are not RVs. These are not recreational vehicles. They don't even have wheels. This is not allowed. And they registered about a dozen bylaw violations on title to the property, which of course then meant that they couldn't refinance the property. They couldn't sell the property as it currently stood. And so my client and I have essentially had to pay off all of these people to move to new parks where tiny homes are allowed and deal with the city for 6 months so that we can clear those off titles so that we can now sell this property to recover the funds. So we're seeing issues like that where people just, again, getting involved in something that they necessarily don't understand properly, or are just trying to cut corners, or in some cases, like the case of the Lion Share Group stuff, just full on committing fraud, and eventually it's catching up. So what does this mean for you, for our wonderful audience? So a couple things. We'll continue to see more distressed properties coming to the market. So this is an opportunity to look at a silver lining. It is an opportunity for the right buyers to get in and maybe get some good deals. However, they really need to be aware of the risks and challenges of buying a property under power of sale. As I said, they're often going to be tenanted. So you're going to have to be prepared to deal with that and understand the challenges that come with trying to deal with tenants. Or they may be in need of significant repairs. I've got clients that are invested in properties up again in sort of more remote areas where the power's been shut off for 6 months and there's huge damage to the house, or the tenants stop paying their gas bill and then the gas company literally removed the gas meter off the property so they would stop stealing gas. So things like that that you may not be aware of because as a lender, you're not personally involved in the property, right? Generally, so you're getting your checks every month, you're happy, and then all of a sudden you find out, oh, that landlord, that borrower hasn't been to that property in 6 months, and we have no idea what's going on. And there may be bylaw issues to deal with as well. So you need to be aware of that. And what that means for you as a buyer. How are those going to get resolved? Are they going to be resolved prior to closing or not? So I'm dealing with one right now where a client was lending money to a gentleman up in Fenland Falls, and he had this beautiful, massive property, and he'd been extracting peat moss from the property and using that as his income. And when we eventually took possession because he stopped making the payments, and we went through the whole process, we went through summary judgment, etc. When we were finally able to take possession of the property, we discovered from the city, well, peat extraction is not allowed at all on that property, and he's just been doing that illegally for years and has several, bylaw violations and bylaw orders to stop basically destroying the land he lives on. So that was a big surprise. My client was never, told that when they made the initial investment. They thought, yes, this is a peat extraction. Again, I wasn't involved in the mortgage getting set up, but it's an exciting discovery when you find out that most of the value in the land is actually illegal. So that's been interesting. In terms of lenders should be more cautious. Again, there are still opportunities out there if you're interested in private lending, but a couple of the key lessons that I think some of my clients have learned is don't lend money you need quickly. Don't lend money you need right away or that you may need in an emergency. A mortgage is not a good emergency fund. I've had several clients that are lenders that are now also borrowing because their loans that they lent out are not paying, and now their own debts are adding up. And you don't want to be in that situation where you're borrowing money to cover the money you've lent out. So you should only ever be lending out money that you can afford to go without for several months if you have to go down this process. The goal of every power sale process is to recover all of your money, of course, and you should always be aware of loan to value ratios and all that so that you're not doing a overly risky investment. But in terms of regular income, if you're relying on a regular income from an investment such as a mortgage, and those people stop paying, you may not get paid for 6 or 8 months, depending on how lengthy the process is and how hard it is to sell that property if necessary. So again, just making sure that you're, playing with money you don't need right away. It's also important, as with any investment, you got to diversify. So spread your mortgages among more properties. Don't dump it all into one person. I know some people go, some people, a lot of my clients, well, I worked with this guy for years and he's great. I'll keep giving him money. I'll keep giving him money. Suddenly, all of their properties are in trouble. So by spreading it over more people, you're reducing those risks. Make sure collateral properties are useful. A lot of people will bring me deals and say, well, yeah, I know the loan to value is a little high on this one, but then I've got seconds on this, this, and this. And then you look at the mortgages they're putting second mortgages on, or the properties they're putting seconds on, and you think, well, these properties are already maxed out with 3 different other lenders. So those 3 properties could all be sold off by the first mortgagee and you'd be left with nothing. And now your collateral is useless. So don't just assume that because you have collateral on other properties, that's security. You need to look at each property on its own merits and make sure you're comfortable with the loan to value and the total debt equity load on those properties. If you're getting personal guarantees, get bank statements, get asset statements of the guarantors, get as much information as you can about them. There's nothing more frustrating than getting a mortgage and say, a mortgage action from somebody and they say, but I got a personal guarantee. Okay, well, where does that person live? Oh, I don't know. Okay, well, what do they do for a living? I don't know. What other assets do they have? I don't know. Great. So now, even if we get judgment, we now got to book a JD examination. We got to find out, what assets they have. If you don't have that information, what good is the guarantee, right? So you need to make sure you know what you're getting when you're getting a guarantee. Get involved. Be prepared to get your hands dirty. One of my clients who's been doing this for 40 years, he's been spending the last 2 weeks renovating a house we took back by himself because he's underwater and he knows that, but he's willing to do the work. He's willing to paint, do drywall, all these things to build up the equity back so he'll get his money back. If he had to pay someone to do all that work, it's just not gonna the equation's not gonna work out. So, he's 72 and he's still doing this kind of work. But that's how he's been successful in this business, even when things have gone south, is he's prepared to do the work himself when he needs to. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to do that work. That's not what I get paid for. So you need to be prepared to get your hands dirty as a lender, or you need to be prepared to have someone and pay someone to do that. Other options can be, if you're taking back vacant land, look into the subdivision yourself. Get that subdivision approval, because that's going to put a lot of value on your listing. If you could say pre-approved for 3 lots. We've already talked to the city. We've already talked to the planning committee. We're good. If you want to buy this and develop it, we've done half the work for you. And that may take some time. It may take a bit of money, but you're going to have a lot more buyers when they know that they can subdivide it versus the risk of, we think we'll be able to subdivide it, so we're going to discount the price because of that risk. And then, as I mentioned before, we're seeing more foreclosures and what we call, you can call it quit claim, which is essentially, instead of me taking the property, selling it, getting my money back, and whatever's left over going to the mortgagor or subsequent creditors, we'll do essentially a credit swap where I say, or maybe that's not the right word, but you say, look, you owe me 400 grand, the property's worth 410. If we sell it, there's going to be real estate commission, there's going to be legal fees. Wipe out my mortgage and I'll give you the property. You'll get legal ownership of the property. And sometimes that works in specific circumstances, where there's no second mortgagee or subsequent creditors, where the value is, so low that it makes sense. You want to have obviously some appraisals to back that up. And if it's a situation where the lender is in a position where they're willing to take on the mortgage or the property, right? Again, not every mortgagee wants to be a landlord. Most of them don't. That's why they invest in mortgage instead of in properties. But where it does make sense, that can be a creative solution that allows you to recover the value through the value of the asset, hold it for a couple of years, rent it out, or just hold it until the market improves, and then you collect your money. You sort of recover your money at that point. Okay, so one last sort of slide here, just some other, this is kind of a grab bag of other challenges and other items that I'm always learning and being reminded of. So obviously we talked about tenants. Just for those who may not be aware, the Mortgages Act, Section 47, Sub 1, says a person who becomes the mortgagee in possession of a mortgaged residential complex, which is the subject of a tenancy agreement between the mortgagor and a tenant, shall be deemed to be the landlord. So I, as the lender, cannot kick out residential tenants when I kick out the owner. My order for possession, if I go get one, is only good as against the owner and what we call their like. If that person that lives in that property can show me payments to the landlord, for the last 6 months, then unfortunately I'm stuck with them. I can't just kick them out. I'm going to have to go through the landlord tenant process. And if they start paying me rent, well, then I got to collect that rent, and I can't, I have to find, I have to obey the rules of the Residential Tenancies Act when it comes to terminating their lease. So, if you know that the property is tenanted, attorn the rents right away, issue notice of attornment, start collecting those rents. Do not let them pay rent to the other person, to the mortgagor. If they do, let them know that doesn't count. I'm going to take you to the board. And unfortunately, these days we have to get more aggressive with tenants. But if you can work with the tenants, it's going to make your life a lot easier. Insurance. This is always a challenge. I have not yet found an insurance company who will give me insurance on a property until I am in possession of it. So if I start a mortgage collection action and the insurance lapses and we don't have possession of the property yet, we're still in the early stages. I've never been able to, and if someone has and can send me their information, then I would be grateful. I've not been able to find an insurer that will give us insurance until we can show that we're in possession. And the reason for this is obvious. If we don't control the property, how can we stop the other person from burning it down, for example, or destroying it? So until a insurance provider knows that you're in control of the property, that you've secured it, that you've got someone checking on it weekly, etc., they're not going to issue an insurance policy. And this creates a huge problem because there's and there is no insurance on the property. I've had this just happen to a client of mine recently where the house on the property burnt down tragically with the borrower in it. There was some drug use complications there, and there was no insurance on the property because the insurance had lapsed and we were not in possession of the property yet because he was living there and we hadn't been able to get an order for possession quickly enough. And so, fortunately, in that case, the value of the mortgage was less than the value of the land even without a property on it. But it could have been much worse because there was just no way for us to get insurance, and there was no way for us to, the only way to force the borrower to get the insurance is to start a power sale process. And like I said, it takes some time to actually get that order for possession. So that is a gap in the situation currently, or in a gap in the process currently, and something that we just need to sort of be aware of. Tax arrears and super priority liens. This is a very important title insurance issue. All title insurers now, when you're doing a lender's policy, have an option for super priority lien endorsement. Get it. Just get it. It's like $40 extra. And basically, it covers any liens that arise after your mortgage, but that could take what's called super priority. So that would be property tax arrears, CRA, certain CRA liens. So if you own your own business and you owe the government HST, that HST arrears can form a super priority lien. So there are certain things that, despite arising after a mortgage, go in priority, and that super priority endorsement from Stewart Title or FCT is going to save your client's ass. So be sure to get that. Commercial properties, unlike residential properties, those tenancies are not protected unless the lease was registered on title prior to the mortgage. That's the general rule. Obviously, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, a commercial tenancy does not take priority over a mortgage. They do not have the same protections as are guaranteed in the Residential Tenancies Act. So if you're dealing with commercial properties, seize those rents right away. Get in there, meet the tenants, work with the tenants. You want those tenancies, if they're good tenancies, you want those tenancies to continue because that is going to improve the cap rate of your property and allow you to sell it. So a lot of these Forge and Foster properties I'm dealing with right now, that is the big thing my client has been doing, is meeting with all the tenants, signing non-disturbance agreements saying, look, we're not going to interrupt your occupancy if you just keep paying what you've been paying. We've been paying out debts that Forge and Foster own to the tenants so that we're not offsetting the rents, so that our rent roll is at 100% and looks better to potential buyers, rather than saying, well, yeah, they are paying 20 grand a month, but we're offsetting it by 15 grand a month because the former owner, or the owner, owes them a bunch of money for improvements that they were supposed to pay for. So there's strategies like that where you want to work with those tenants and make those commercial tenancies look as appealing as possible to new buyers so that you can sell those properties. You also want to, the biggest challenge with commercial properties, who's paying for utilities? I have spent so much time with Electra the last 3 weeks trying to stop power shutoffs because we weren't clear. It was never clear who was dealing with utilities. Was it the tenant? Was it us? Each individual unit was different. And so trying to get all that information has been a real challenge. And in the meantime, arrears are piling up on the Electra accounts. And then they're calling and saying, hey, we're going to shut your power off in 2 days. And we got a call from the tenant saying, hey, I have 7 fridges on my property. If those shut off, I will sue you for all of the lost food. So having a good property manager, a commercial property manager, working with you on that is going to make your life a lot easier. Almost done, because I know we're getting close to the 11 o'clock time. Farms, livestock, and pets. This is a one that I've sort of just started getting involved with because I'm dealing with my first farm property, which has been a real treat. There is a specific act called the Farm Debt Mediation Act. And what that says is that if a secured creditor wishes to enforce their security against a farmer, specifically a farmer or a farm property, you're required to issue a specific notice and then also file it with the regional office. And then you have to wait 15 days before any further steps can be taken. And what this allows is for a mediation process that is specific to farmers and their debts. It's obviously designed to protect our farmers because farmers are so important to our economy and our food system. So there is a specific sort of carve out for them. And so you need to ensure that if you're dealing with a farm property, you are issuing that notice and you're filing it. Okay. You also have to be aware, and so in this case that the farm I'm dealing with had about 800 head of cattle until about a month ago. They were fattening all the cattle up. Well, a mortgage doesn't give you the right to livestock unless you have a specific, general security agreement in place that says, yeah, I can seize the livestock as part of the debt. You're not entitled in the same way that a mortgage doesn't give you security over chattels. It doesn't give you security over cattle. Sorry, I couldn't resist. So you as a mortgagee, if you're taking possession and there's a bunch of cows or horses or sheep on that farm, you have to figure out a way to manage that. So either those animals need to go to a neighboring farm and you pay that neighboring farmer to care for them. You have to track them properly. We've had to deal with farms where we've had to get horses boarded at the farm down the street. And it's the same with pets in a residential scenario. Awfully enough, we've had a situation where the tenants were suffering from some pretty severe drug issues. They were evicted and they left their dog in the property. And it was about a half hour after the eviction when we were doing a walk through the property. And in this case, a number of the tenants had actually been arrested for drug crimes as well. There was a dog in the property. So we had to call the SPCA and have them, they were supposed to come pick up the dog. Fortunately, the one owner did return and got their dog. And so we obviously released the dog to them. But you have to be prepared to deal with that potential scenario. If there's going to be pets, you have to have a way of dealing with those. And then the last sort of wrinkle that can come up, I think someone's unmuted, is bankruptcy. So if you have reason to suspect the borrower is going to be declaring bankruptcy or has declared bankruptcy, we always suggest just serving your notice of intention to enforce security in the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act along with your notice of sale. It gives, I think it's a 10-day notice. Just serve it at the same time. It covers your butt. But also be aware that bankruptcy is going to potentially complicate your process when it comes time to recover shortfalls if there's a shortfall in the sale. An important thing to note, and this can trip some people up, and even the trustees sometimes don't understand this, a trustee in bankruptcy does not have priority over a mortgagee. So if I have a mortgage on a property, I dealt with this at the beginning of this year. If I have a mortgage on a property, not me, but my client has a mortgage on a property, and that property is being managed now by a trustee in bankruptcy, that trustee is basically in the same position as the owner was. So I have a duty to report to them. I have a duty to deal with them in the same way I dealt with the owner. That trustee does not get to interfere with my mortgage process, though. So we had to put a trustee in bankruptcy in his place earlier this year by saying, look, we're already in possession of the property. We're going to sell it. We'll send you our final accounting when it's done, but our secured creditor takes priority over any of the other bankruptcy creditors and you as the trustee. So that's an important thing to be aware of. So yeah, those are kind of the where we're at these days in the power sale sphere. It is busier, it is more complicated, it is more interesting, it's more challenging, but it is at the end of the day, it is still a functional process that allows the world of mortgages to continue to operate. And it is certainly something that if you're interested in real estate and you're interested in litigation, it can be a very interesting space to get into. So I guess we've got about 10 minutes. I'm happy to take some questions. See,
Matt,
there are some
can
in
I
the
direct you to the chat, Matt?
chat.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, yeah.
The first one, the first substantive
Sorry.
question
So,
here is para.
uh, sorry, my Wi-Fi is being funky.
Do you want me to read them, Matt?
No, I'll do it. So, I see. Sorry, my Wi-Fi is just being a little funky right now. I see from Caitlin, she's been doing it for 30 years. The last few years have been busier. If a tenant is evicted, can a landlord recover or attempt to recover the rental arrears, or do they essentially cut their losses? No, a landlord can still go through that process through the landlord tenant board and getting a judgment for arrears. And often we will see, so we're dealing with this on at least one property right now, where the landlord got the eviction order and then gave us the eviction order so that we could enforce it. I'm just going to turn my camera off just to help with my bandwidth. We were able to use the eviction enforcement to get the property because from the landlord's perspective, it was better for them to let us get possession and deal with the property than it was for them to try and still deal with the tenant. I know the buyer should get the super priority lien endorsement, but is there any issue getting title insurance in the first place on residential power sale properties? Not that I've encountered. The whole point of the power sale process is it gives clean title to the buyer. Um, Party buyer, and there's no fraud. So, sometimes you get more flags on your insurance policy when trying to deal with, I'm sure every real estate title where they just don't seem to understand the transaction. But generally speaking, a transfer under power sale is going to give good, clean to the buyer, and there's no they shouldn't be able to get a insurance policy. Uh, so,
Matt, Matt,
borrower
Matt, I hope you don't mind me stopping you. You're cutting in and out. It's getting hard to
paying off
hear
the
you.
first, did not have enough equity to cover everything. What happened in that situation? So, first the
Matt, Matt, sorry, it's Mark.
sorry,
Matt, we're having some trouble
yeah,
hearing you. You're cutting in and out. You have a bad connection. So just FYI, it's getting pretty choppy in your response. Is there a way to, I guess, get a better connection? I don't know if you can switch to Tether or something. Oh, I think Matt has left the building for a second, guys. Just bear with us. Just small technical issue. Taha, I'll tell you, I've never had trouble actually securing um, title insurance on a power sale with super priority lien endorsements. Just FYI, it's never proven more difficult.
apologies. I've gotten to a better spot here.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt.
Okay. Um, so the question was borrowers in default on first and second. Second can't buy out the first, and the property doesn't have enough equity to cover the second. What happens? So in that situation, the first mortgagee can complete the power sale because the power sale will just wipe out the second mortgage, and even if there's not enough to pay them out in full. The second mortgagee would then need to get, or at some point, either during the process or after the process, get judgment against the mortgagor, and then pursue damages the way you would with any other claim. So either garnishing wages, enforcing a writ of seizure and sale against other assets they have, be it other properties, cars, boats, whatever. But yeah, we're seeing more and more of that in second mortgages where if the first has enough equity but the second doesn't, the first will sell, the second will get wiped out, and the second is now left holding the bag and trying to find other ways of collecting that money. So we are certainly going to see, I think, more and more people that are getting partial payouts, and then people, the issue then becomes, that mortgagor declares bankruptcy, and now, we're getting pennies on the dollar, and then that judgment is wiped out, and there's not much left to do, unfortunately. So again, this is why it becomes so important to understand, especially if you're a second mortgage, what other assets that borrower has, what other assets you can enforce against, and what it's gonna and what the first mortgage looks like. Okay, is it possible to create an occupancy agreement rather than a tenancy agreement to bypass having to go to landlord-tenant board? Is there any agreement or anything you can do to get around LTV? Short answer would be no. Trying to get around the LTV, the best way to get around the LTV is money. So, we will very often say, look, we'll give you X number of dollars if you sign an N11 and sign an agreement. And one of the things to make sure you're doing is giving that tenant the opportunity to consider the offer. You don't want them to be able to go to the landlord tenant board later and say, I was coerced into, signing this N11. They told me if I didn't, they'd kick me out anyway. You don't want that. You want to say, look, we get it. This situation sucks for everybody. So we want to make your life easier. We'll give you moving expenses. We'll waive your rent for the next 2 months, and we'll give you $5,000 to help you find a new place. If you're cool with that, we'll have you sign this agreement to terminate your tenancy, and that way everyone could go on their way. And that can work really well. Those funds that you're paying towards the tenant should be recoverable under the collection action because they are the costs of enforcement. So, if I'm owed 500 and I have to pay someone 10 grand to move out, now I'm owed 510. And that will be recoverable under, the proceeds of the sale under power of sale. So that is a consideration to go ahead with. The downside of that is now tenants are catching on and are extorting landlords for huge sums. I had a client that actually was able to put a down payment on their own house because their landlord paid them 30 grand to get out of their house. So that was nice for them, but not nice for the landlord. I've heard HST, this is always the fun one. I've heard HST may be applicable on power sale. How can I find out if that applies to a certain property, or is that for the lawyer to find out? So that is certainly a question for the lawyer. The challenge with power sale and HST is that a mortgagee under power sale is not going to give you an HST indemnity, right? So when you normally buy a house if I sell my house to someone, I will indemnify saying it's used residential. There's no HST applicable. If I'm not the owner of the house, if I'm the mortgagee, I'm not going to give you that indemnity. I don't know if they claimed income tax credits or input tax credits, I should say, against the property. I don't know if they've been treating it or using it as a commercial property. And therefore there is going to be some HST applicable or for, on a portion of it. So that is where the buyer, the buyer's agent, and the buyer's lawyer need to do their due diligence to see, okay, do we genuinely believe that this is just used residential property, therefore HST should not be applicable, therefore we're comfortable not getting the HST indemnity, and saying that HST is not going to be owing on this. So that is really a due diligence question and a tricky one. But again, from a practical perspective, if it looks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If it looks like a used house, and it probably is a used house, and therefore HST is probably not applicable, and you're probably not going to get dinged. But again, that's not legal advice. That's just general practical information. Okay, I'll do one more, and then it's 11 o'clock. I'll let everyone go out. In a power sale deal, is the buyer still responsible for a Section 116 of the defaulted owner if they are non-resident, as most lenders won't give any non-resident declarations? Yeah, that's a tricky one. We will not give, as a mortgagee, we won't give a non-resident declaration about the owner. We will give a non-resident declaration about the mortgagee, but that doesn't really help you. So that is, that is going to be another one that's going to have to, it's similar to the HST issue. You got to do your due diligence and see whether you have reason to believe that the owner was a non-resident, and that is certainly something you can ask the seller if they know this information. If they know that the person lives down the street or lives in another town over, then that should give you the comfort you need. But again, you're not going to get the guarantee or the declaration, so there's going to be that risk of essentially an audit, I guess, at some point.
Matt, just before I thank you, can I ask you to answer one last question? Brian Madigan
Sure.
gives a lot back to our forum, and he has a question: how frequent are foreclosures, and how long is the process? Can you do that last question, and then we'll
Yeah,
wrap?
absolutely. So they're still fairly rare. I've only got about two or three of them currently. We are using them in situations where we just know the equity is not there and where the lender is willing to take on the property. And that's sort of the big determining factor often is a lender doesn't want to be a landlord. They don't want to be a property owner. And so why would they go through that process? But in some cases, they're willing to do it. They're just, for any number of reasons. In terms of length of the process, it can be quite quick. If the borrower does not defend, you can, issue your claim, wait your 20 days, file for default judgment, get your judgment for foreclosure, and get her done. So you can get it done in, if you're pretty quick, you can probably get it done in 45 days. If they defend or if they serve a demand for redemption or a demand for judicial sale, then it can convert to 6, 8, 12 months. The other downside of foreclosure is, your legal costs are not covered. So in a power of sale, if I charge you, X number of dollars in legals when we sell the property, assuming there's enough money there, you're not out of pocket anything. If you foreclose, there's no money coming to you, so you're going to have to pay me for my time. So there's that extra cost that is literally out of your own pocket. So that's the other sort of downside of it for those that don't want to be, throwing good money after bad.
Terrific. All right. So, guys, if there's one thing I want you to take from the presentations collectively that we always put on, it's that going to a professional who understands their subject matter is the height of diligence and competence, and really what should be expected from every person who asks you for recommendations. And as you're seeing, people have specialties in special areas. Now, of course, there are more people on the forum than just Matt Gibson who focus in on power of sales, but Matt has been a stalwart and someone who has given us tremendous support in understanding this area. And he, like others in his field, are experts at power of sales. And when you encounter these types of issues, going to people who have that heightened expertise is the order of the day. Matt, I can't thank you enough for your time, for your diligence, for your expertise, and for your knowledge. And above all, for the continued support that you give each and every one of us as we try to make our way in this strange new real estate world of falling prices. Thank you. I think we had about 85 people at the height that joined us, and there'll be many hundreds more that watch this in the coming days as we post it to the forum. We do have an exciting list of speakers coming up in the coming weeks. I'll reveal that on the forum. And I thank each and every one of you for your attendance today. Everyone go have a profitable day. And we're looking forward to seeing you during our next session. Thank you. Take care. Have a good day, guys.